I've always loved the wilderness, the solitude, the beauty, the untouched silence. It's my escape. But this time, something escaped with me. Imagine finding a rusted RV in the middle of a forest, miles from any road. Imagine stepping inside, only to find that someone or something hasn't left. And when you finally think you're alone, you hear it. A sound so unnatural it freezes your blood. I'm a forester, and what I experienced deep in the Appalachian woods still keeps me awake at night. I was trained to know every sound, every sign, every shadow in the forest, but this, I can't explain. What did I see? Or worse, what saw me? If you think you can handle the truth, keep watching. And before we dive in, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories like this. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. Let me know in the comments. What would you do if you were trapped in the woods with something watching you? I've been a forester for over 12 years, and if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I would have said there wasn't a single thing in the woods that could scare me. I've spent my entire career out there, in some of the most remote and untouched places in the country. Thick forests, deep ravines, and towering canopies are as familiar to me as the walls of your home might be to you. But that confidence, that connection to the wild, it's gone. Torn away by something I encountered on an assignment I'll never forget. It started with an email. It was a typical Wednesday morning in late September when my work computer pinged with a new assignment. I opened it up to see that I'd been assigned a tract of land near the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. This wasn't just any forest, it was old growth. For a forester, that's like winning the lottery. These are ancient trees, untouched for hundreds of years, a living time capsule of what the land looked like before humanity left its mark. I couldn't believe my luck. Old growth forests are rare treasures, and this was my chance to experience one before it was logged. I felt a pang of guilt knowing I'd be the one marking the trees for harvest, but the thought of walking among giants, seeing trees that had stood for centuries, was too exciting to ignore. By noon, I'd packed up everything I'd need for a few days in the field. Camping gear, GPS equipment, a clinometer, my trusty neon orange marking paint, and enough food and water to last me through the survey. I loaded it all into Piper, my old but reliable white Ford Ranger. Piper and I had been through a lot over the years, muddy trails, steep mountain passes, even the occasional flooded road, but she'd never let me down. The drive to the trailhead was long but beautiful, winding through narrow country roads flanked by rolling hills and dense forests. As I got closer to my destination, the houses and farms became fewer and farther between, replaced by endless stretches of trees. The GPS signaled I was nearing the old trailhead just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. When I stepped out of Piper, the forest greeted me with a wave of cool, damp air, carrying the rich, earthy scent of moss and fallen leaves. The trail leading into the forest was overgrown, clearly in use for years, but that only made it more enticing. I strapped on my heavy pack, locked up Piper, and set off into the woods. The first sign that something wasn't right came about an hour into the hike. The trail had all but disappeared, swallowed by time and nature. I was navigating by GPS now, bushwhacking my way through underbrush and stepping over fallen logs when I came across an enormous sycamore tree. Its white bark glowed faintly in the fading light, and I stopped to admire its size. That's when I saw it. About 12 feet up, tangled in the branches, was the skeletal remains of a deer. Its head lolled unnaturally to the side, empty sockets staring blankly at the forest below. Scraps of fur clung to the bones, and a foul smell lingered in the air. At first, I thought it might have been dragged up there by a mountain lion, but then I noticed something that sent a shiver down my spine. The deer wasn't just lying there. It was tied to the branches with bits of rope and fabric, its limbs deliberately arranged. Beneath it, carved, deep into the sycamore's bark, was a single symbol, an O. I stared at the grotesque display, a mix of shock and confusion bubbling in my chest. Who would do something like this? And why? The carving looked old, weathered by years of exposure, but the deer couldn't have been there that long. Something about the whole scene felt wrong. Trying to shake off the unease, I reminded myself that I was alone out here. Whoever had done this was long gone, and there was no reason to think they'd still be hanging around. I pressed on, eager to reach the old growth stand before nightfall. By the time I arrived, the last light of day was fading, and the forest had grown eerily quiet. The old growth loomed ahead of me, towering trees casting long shadows over the forest floor. The lack of underbrush was striking. It felt like stepping into a cathedral, the open space beneath the canopy stretching out endlessly in every direction. I couldn't help but pause to take it all in. The trees were massive, their trunks gnarled and twisted with age, their branches reaching skyward like the arms of ancient giants. The air was cool and still, carrying the faintest scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it too. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, just the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I set up camp on the edge of the old growth stand, pitching my tent in a small clearing and building a fire ring with stones I found nearby. As the flames flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees, I tried to shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was probably just my imagination, I told myself. The isolation, the silence, it was playing tricks on me. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag staring up at the stars through the mesh roof of my tent, I couldn't stop thinking about the deer and the symbol carved into the sycamore. Who had done it, and why? The questions churned in my mind until I finally drifted into a restless sleep. I didn't know it then, but that would be the last peaceful night I'd ever have in the woods. The next morning came with a chill in the air, the forest bathed in a pale, misty light. My watch alarm chirped at 5:30 a.m., jarring me from a fitful sleep. I sat up, stretching stiff muscles, and peeked out of the tent. The world outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a heavy blanket. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just the faint sound of my own breathing. Breakfast was quick and uneventful, instant oatmeal and coffee brewed on a portable stove. I forced myself to focus on the task at hand, pulling out my GPS, marking paint and equipment. The sooner I got started, the sooner I could finish the survey and leave this strange forest behind. By 6:30, I was packed up and ready to explore the old growth stand. The dense canopy above allowed only slivers of sunlight to pierce through, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. Walking beneath those ancient trees felt like stepping into another world, one untouched by time. The air was thick with the scent of damp moss and decaying wood. The first few hours of work were uneventful. I moved from tree to tree, measuring diameters, calculating heights, and marking selected trunks with bright orange X's. Each spray of paint felt like an intrusion on something sacred, but it was my job. I reminded myself that these trees had stood for centuries, and even though some would be harvested, the company planned to leave enough to preserve the ecosystem. But as the morning wore on, the unease I'd felt the day before began to creep back in. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot or the hiss of paint from my can. And then there were the signs. The first one was subtle. A tree with deep scratches raked across its bark, higher than any bear could reach. I paused, running my fingers over the grooves. They were clean, deliberate, like they'd been made with some kind of tool. But who would be out here with a tool big enough to do this? The second sign was harder to ignore. As I rounded a massive oak, I found what looked like a crude wooden carving hanging from its lower branches. It was a humanoid figure, no more than a foot tall, made from sticks and twine. Its head was a misshapen, not of wood, and its arms and legs jutted out at unnatural angles. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding. I'd seen things like this before, stories of strange objects left in the woods by locals, symbols of old rituals or folklore. But finding one here in this isolated patch of forest sent a chill down my spine. I debated turning back, but curiosity won out. I told myself it was just some old relic, something left by hunters or hikers long ago. I pushed forward, deeper into the forest, determined to finish my work. By mid-afternoon, I stumbled across something that made the unease boil over into outright fear. The RV. I nearly missed it at first. The RV was tucked into a shallow dip in the forest floor, half concealed by a cluster of ancient oaks and a blanket of moss and leaves. The rusted hulk blended seamlessly into the earthy tones of the woods, and if I hadn't been walking in that exact direction, I might have passed it by without a second glance. But once I saw it, I couldn't look away. It was an old Winnebago, the kind you'd expect to see rolling down some highway in the 1970s, not abandoned in the middle of a dense forest miles from the nearest road. The once bright paint was now a faded patchwork of rust and peeling white. The windows were clouded with grime, and one of the side mirrors dangled precariously by a single rusted screw. What the hell? I muttered under my breath. Stepping closer, the RV sat at an awkward angle, its front end slightly sunken into the ground as though it had been there for decades. Moss and vines crept up its sides, nature slowly reclaiming the vehicle. One of the tires was completely flat, its rubber cracked and brittle, while the others had long since been swallowed by the earth. I circled it cautiously, my footsteps crunching softly on the forest floor. The air felt heavier here, the silence even more oppressive. As I rounded the back, I noticed a few more strange details. The rear bumper was dented and smeared with what looked like deep brown stains. The back window was shattered, shards of glass littering the ground below. The side door hung ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. I hesitated. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to walk away, to pretend I hadn't seen it. But curiosity is a powerful thing. Against my better judgment, I approached the open door, stepping carefully over the muddy ground that surrounded the RV like a moat. The interior was dark, even in the weak daylight filtering through the trees. I pulled out my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal a scene of utter decay. The front seats were stripped down to their metal frames, the upholstery long since eaten away by time and rodents. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dirt and leaves, and the air was heavy with the stench of mildew and rot. "Hello," I called. Out, my voice barely above a whisper. Of course, no one answered. But as the beam of my flashlight swept across the narrow living space, I felt a strange prickling at the back of my neck. There was something off about the place, something I couldn't quite put into words. That's when I saw it. Near the back of the RV, a crude pile of clothes was arranged on the floor. For distinct sizes, 2 adults, 2 children. all soaked through with dirt and decay. And at the very top of the pile, sitting like a grotesque centerpiece, was the skull of a deer. I didn't know what to think. Who or what had left this here, and why? The symbols scratched into the walls, the fresh footprints circling the RV, none of it made sense. And then, as I stepped back, I realized I wasn't alone. Something was watching me. Do you think you'd be able to handle what I found next? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're as hooked as I was, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next, because this is where things take a turn you won't believe. My heart pounded as I stood frozen at the edge of the RV's open door. The beam of my flashlight locked on the pile of decaying clothes and the grotesque deer skull perched atop them. For a long moment I couldn't move. It wasn't just the sight. It was the atmosphere inside that gutted wreck. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as though the RV itself was watching me, daring me to step inside. I swallowed hard and stepped back, my boots squelching in the damp earth around the RV. Something wasn't right here. The pile of clothes, it wasn't random. They'd been placed deliberately, almost reverently, as though someone or something had intended for them to be found this way. And the skull? Its hollow sockets seemed to follow me, even as I turned away from the vehicle to catch my breath. What the hell is this place? I muttered under my breath, trying to ground myself. The logical part of my brain was screaming at me to leave, to get back to Piper and drive far away from these woods. But logic has never been a match for curiosity, and before I knew it, I was circling the RV again, flashlight in hand, searching for answers. The outside of the vehicle offered little insight. The moss and vines clinging to its sides were thick, almost unnaturally so, as though they'd been drawn to the RV's decaying metal like flies to a carcass. I spotted a faint trail of footprints in the mud, circling the RV just as I had. They were old, probably weeks, maybe months, but their size was unsettling. Larger than any humans, they were broad and deep, the kind of prints you'd expect from something heavy. I crouched to inspect one of the prints more closely, my flashlight casting sharp shadows across the muddy ground. It was oddly shaped, almost like a human foot but elongated, with claw-like indentations where the toes should have been. I shuddered and straightened up, my breath fogging in the cool air. Steeling myself, I turned back to the RV and stepped inside. The creak of the rusted door hinges echoed unnaturally in the silence. The interior was even worse than I'd initially thought. The walls were streaked with dark stains that looked like water damage at first glance, but the smell told a different story. It wasn't just mildew or rot. It was something more acrid, something that made my stomach churn. The small kitchen area was gutted, the cabinets hanging open, their contents long since reduced to dust and debris. A single, rusted knife lay on the counter, its blade dulled and pitted. The sink was filled with murky, stagnant water, though there hadn't been rain for days. I moved cautiously toward the back, where the pile of clothes and the skull waited. The closer I got, the more oppressive the air became, like the RV itself didn't want me there. And that's when I noticed it. Scratched into the walls, faint but deliberate, were dozens of symbols. The symbols scratched into the walls stopped me in my tracks. At first, I thought they might be random, graffiti left by whoever had been here before, but the longer I looked, the less random they seemed. Each carving was deliberate, like they'd been etched with purpose. Some resembled crude figures, almost human in shape but distorted, their limbs too long, their heads bulbous and misshapen. Others were geometric patterns, circles inside circles, jagged lines crisscrossing each other, and spirals that seemed to pull my eyes toward their center. I reached out and ran my fingers over one of the carvings. The edges were sharp, the cuts fresh enough that flakes would curl at the edges. My gut twisted. Someone or something had been here recently. I forced myself to take a step back, my flashlight flickering slightly as if the batteries were giving out. I gave it a sharp tap and the beam steadied, cutting through the dimness again. I scanned the rest of the RV's interior, taking in the layers of grime and decay. Then my light caught something that made my blood run cold. On the ceiling, directly above the pile of clothes and the deer skull, was another symbol. Unlike the others, this one wasn't carved, it was painted. A crude blood-red circle with a jagged X slashed through its center. The paint looked old, flaking in some places, but the color was vivid, as though it had been refreshed recently. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, just like the skull below it. I had seen enough. Turning on my heel, I moved toward the door, eager to put distance between myself and this horrifying scene. As I stepped outside, I took a deep breath of the cool forest air, trying to steady my racing heart. But the sight waiting for me outside was no comfort. The footprints in the mud, the strange, elongated prints I'd noticed earlier, were no longer faint and old. They were fresh, pressed deep into the ground, and they weren't just circling the RV anymore. They led away into the forest, disappearing into the thick undergrowth. I crouched down to inspect them again, my mind racing. The edges of the prints were sharp, the mud still wet and shiny where they'd been disturbed. Whatever had made them couldn't be far. A faint sound reached my ears, so quiet I almost missed it. It was a low, rhythmic rustling, like something moving slowly through the brush. My eyes darted to the tree line, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. The rustling stopped. For a long moment, the forest was silent again, save for the faint whistle of the wind through the trees. Then, just as I started to convince myself I'd imagined it, the sound came again. This time, it was closer. I didn't wait to find out what it was. Gripping my flashlight tightly, I turned and hurried away from the RV, the feeling of being watched heavier than ever. I moved quickly, my boots crunching against the forest floor as I tried to put as much distance as possible between myself and the RV. The deeper I went into the old-growth forest, the quieter everything seemed to get. The wind barely stirred the leaves overhead, and the usual background hum of insects and birds was completely absent. The silence felt unnatural, oppressive, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. But what unsettled me most was the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. It was the unmistakable sensation of unseen eyes tracking my every step. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking just out of sight. There was never anything there, but the feeling didn't go away. As I pressed on, my mind replayed everything I'd seen at the RV. The symbols on the walls, the strange footprints in the mud, the pile of clothes topped with the deer skull. All of it pointed to something I couldn't explain. And that sound, the rustling, whatever had made it wasn't far. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, its cold metal slick with sweat from my trembling hands. Then, up ahead, I saw something that made me freeze in my tracks. About 30 feet away, just visible through the dense undergrowth, was a tree marked with one of the same symbols I'd seen inside the RV. A circle with a jagged X slashed through it, etched deep into the bark. I didn't remember marking this tree, and I certainly hadn't seen any carvings like this in my survey earlier. Slowly, I approached it, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I noticed something even stranger. The ground around the tree was littered with animal bones, clean and white as if they'd been picked clean by something or someone. I crouched down, picking up one of the larger bones. It looked like a deer femur, but it was snapped clean in half, the edges splintered in a way that didn't look natural. I dropped it quickly, wiping my hand on my pants as if the act could erase the creeping dread climbing up my spine. That's when I noticed the smell. It hit me like a wave, an overpowering stench of rot and decay mixed with the damp, earthy scent of the forest. My stomach turned as I instinctively brought a hand to my face, trying to block out the odor. It was strongest near the base of the tree, where the pile of bones was thickest. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dim light. Just beyond the tree, the undergrowth seemed disturbed, as if something large had passed through recently. Broken branches, flattened ferns, and deep grooves in the dirt led further into the forest. I debated whether to follow the trail, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back. Yet, curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I took a cautious step forward, following the tracks into the thickening shadows. The trail of broken branches and flattened vegetation pulled me deeper into the forest, each step more reluctant than the last. My flashlight beam flickered as I moved, illuminating the faint path carved through the undergrowth. The stench of decay clung to the air, growing stronger the farther I went. It was as if the forest itself had been holding on to this smell, waiting for someone foolish enough to stumble into it. I stopped abruptly when I saw the first claw mark. It was gouged deep into the trunk of an ancient oak, jagged and deliberate, with splinters of wood still clinging to the grooves. These weren't scratches from a bear or any other animal I'd encountered before. They were too high, too wide, and too precise. Whatever had made them had strength and intent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I scanned the area with my flashlight. The forest around me seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, as if the trees themselves were closing in. I tried to steady my breathing, but the oppressive silence made every inhale sound deafening. Just as I was about to turn back, something ahead caught my eye, a clearing, barely visible through the dense thicket of trees. The trail led straight to it, the disturbed ground widening as if whatever had passed through here had paused or lingered. I hesitated for a moment, torn between the urge to flee and the pull of curiosity. Against my better judgment, I stepped forward, pushing aside the undergrowth and stepping into the clearing. The scene before me was something out of a nightmare. In the center of the clearing stood another massive tree, its gnarled trunk scarred with more of those symbols, circles, X's, and jagged lines etched deep into the bark. Around the base of the tree, someone or something had arranged a grotesque display. Bones, dozens of them, were arranged in spiraling patterns that radiated outward like the spokes of a wheel. At the heart of it all sat another deer skull, this one far larger than the one I'd found in the RV, its antlers twisted and blackened as if burned. My flashlight beam trembled as I took in the sight, my mind racing to make sense of it. Who would do this? And why? This wasn't some random act of vandalism. It was ritualistic, intentional, like some kind of offering. I stepped closer, my boots crunching against the brittle bones underfoot. The air was suffocating here, thick with the stench of death, and something else, something metallic. As I moved, I noticed faint grooves in the dirt surrounding the tree. They weren't made by an animal or a machine. They looked like drag marks, as if something heavy had been pulled through the clearing and toward the tree. And then I heard it, a low, guttural sound, half growl, half groan, echoed from somewhere beyond the clearing. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the darkness, my flashlight darting wildly. Something was out there, just beyond the edges of the light. The growl sent a jolt of adrenaline surging through my body. I stood frozen, my flashlight beam bouncing across the edges of the clearing as I searched for the source of the sound. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but my legs refused to move, rooted to the spot by a paralyzing mixture of fear and disbelief. The sound came again, low and guttural, vibrating through the still air. It was closer this time. I gripped my flashlight tighter, the metal slick in my trembling hand, and took a cautious step back. The crunch of bones beneath my boot felt deafening in the suffocating silence. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper, as if I was afraid to be heard. The forest answered with nothing but silence. Then, just as I started to think I had imagined the noise, a shadow moved. It was subtle, just a flicker at the edge of the clearing, where the faint glow of my flashlight couldn't quite reach. My eyes locked onto the movement, my breath caught in my throat. The shadow was tall, impossibly so, and it moved with a strange, jerky rhythm that didn't seem natural. I took another step back, my heart hammering in my chest. The shadow shifted again, this time closer, and I caught a glimpse of something pale, flesh, stretched taut over a grotesquely long limb. "Who's there?" I demanded, forcing as much authority into my voice as I could muster. No response, just the sound of leaves crunching softly, deliberately. As the figure stepped closer, that was when I saw it. The beam of my flashlight caught its face, or at least what should have been its face. It was humanoid, but wrong in every way imaginable. Its head was elongated, with a pointed chin and deep, hollow sockets where eyes should have been. The skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over sharp bones that jutted out at unnatural angles. Its mouth stretched into a wide, lipless grin, revealing rows of blackened, blunt teeth. The creature tilted its head as it stared at me, or through me, with those empty sockets, as if curious about my presence. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, barely able to speak. The creature moved suddenly, its jerky motions almost insect-like as it stepped into the clearing. Its long, spindly limbs ended in claw-like fingers, each one twitching as it reached toward me. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. Dropping the flashlight, I turned and bolted into the forest, adrenaline propelling me forward. Branches tore at my face and arms, and the uneven ground threatened to trip me with every step, but I didn't stop. Behind me, I could hear it. Those guttural growls, those deliberate footsteps, following me into the darkness. The only thought in my mind was escape. Whatever this thing was, it didn't belong here or anywhere. I ran blindly, the forest a blur of shadow and tangled undergrowth. My lungs burned, every breath searing as I pushed my body to its limit. Behind me, the growls grew louder, more guttural, reverberating through the dense trees like a warning. The creature wasn't just following me, it was hunting me. Branches clawed at my face and arms as I tore through the woods, my flashlight abandoned somewhere in the clearing. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the canopy, just enough to keep me from tripping over fallen logs and uneven ground. But it wasn't enough to give me a sense of direction. I was hopelessly lost. Every few steps, I risked a glance over my shoulder, expecting to see the creature lunging toward me. The forest was dark, the shadows impenetrable, but I could feel it. Its presence, its malice, like a weight pressing against my back. My mind raced with questions I didn't want the answers to. What was it? How had it stayed hidden in these woods? And why was it after me? The growls shifted, turning into a sound that was almost laughter, a low, wet, gurgling sound that made my stomach churn. It wasn't human, but there was something disturbingly deliberate about it, like it knew exactly how to rattle me. I tripped, my boot catching on a root, and went sprawling face first into the dirt. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a moment I lay there, dazed and gasping. My heart thudded in my chest as I scrambled to my knees, frantically scanning the darkness around me. The growling stopped. The silence was deafening. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hoot of an owl. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. I froze, straining my ears for any hint of movement. Nothing. My pulse pounded in my ears as I slowly rose to my feet, my eyes darting through the trees. Was it gone? Had it given up? Then I heard it, a faint, wet clicking sound, like nails tapping against wood. It was coming from above. I looked up and my blood turned to ice. The creature was perched in the branches of a massive oak, its limbs impossibly long and twisted, its pale skin glowing faintly in the moonlight, its head cocked to the side, the lipless grin widening as it stared down at me with those hollow sockets. For a moment, we were both still. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stared. I didn't dare breathe, and then it dropped. The thing moved with terrifying speed, its limbs unfolding like a spider as it hurtled toward me. I let out a strangled scream and bolted, adrenaline surging through me once again. I didn't look back this time. I couldn't. I tore through the forest, every nerve in my body screaming at me to move faster. The sound of its pursuit was relentless, wet clicks and guttural growls echoing through the trees. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just chasing me. It was toying with me, letting me feel the weight of its presence just close enough to keep me panicking. My legs burned as I sprinted over uneven ground, my boots slipping on patches of moss and damp leaves. I couldn't afford to fall again. The creature was fast, faster than anything I'd ever encountered, but somehow I managed to stay ahead, the adrenaline in my veins propelling me forward. Up ahead, I spotted a break in the trees, a small clearing bathed in pale moonlight. My mind screamed at me to avoid it, to stay hidden in the shadows, but my lungs begged for air. I stumbled into the open space, collapsing onto my hands and knees, gasping for breath. For a moment, there was silence. The growls and clicks had stopped. All I could hear was a thudding of my heart and the ragged wheeze of my breathing. Maybe it had given up. I looked around the clearing, the moonlight, casting everything in an otherworldly glow. The ground was uneven, covered in patches of grass and clusters of jagged rocks. To my left, a fallen tree stretched across the edge of the clearing, like a natural barricade. I backed up slowly until my back hit the tree, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the clearing's edge. My mind raced with desperate thoughts. Maybe it couldn't follow me here. Maybe the light kept it at bay. Maybe a sharp snap to my right shattered that hope. I turned my head just in time to see it step into the clearing, its elongated limbs moving in unnatural, jerky motions. Its pale skin glistened in the moonlight, stretched tight over its bony frame. The creature's head tilted, that same grotesque grin stretched wide across its lipless mouth. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed myself harder against the fallen tree. It was closer now, less than 20 feet away, and I could see every horrifying detail. The hollow eye sockets, the blackened teeth, the long, claw-like fingers twitching as if eager to grab hold of me. It took another step, then stopped. For a moment, it just stood there, its head cocked as though studying me. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a rock, and hurled it at the creature. The rock struck its shoulder, but it didn't even flinch. Instead, it let out a sound, a horrible, gurgling laugh that sent chills down my spine. Then it dropped to all fours, its limbs bending in impossible ways, and began to crawl toward me. My fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, and I scrambled over the fallen tree, my mind focused on one thing: escape. I barely managed to scramble over the fallen tree before the creature lunged. Its claws scraped against the bark, sending splinters flying as I tumbled to the other side. My chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths, and I didn't wait to see if it would follow. I bolted, my legs screaming in protest, but somehow carrying me forward. The forest ahead was a maze of shadows and obstacles, but the fear coursing through my veins kept me moving. The clicking sounds of its limbs skittering across the ground grew louder, closer, a constant reminder that it was right behind me. Think. I muttered to myself, my voice trembling with terror. I couldn't outrun it forever. I needed a plan, something to buy me time or throw it off my trail. As I darted between trees, my mind raced through the limited options. My gear was back at the campsite, my flashlight lost in the clearing, and the only thing I had on me was a small pocket knife. It was laughable, pathetic, even, but it was all I had. A low, guttural growl to my left pulled me out of my thoughts. I veered to the right, my boots slipping on, a patch of wet moss, and nearly lost my balance. The creature was trying to herd me, forcing me toward something or away from something. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic coursing through me. I spotted a narrow ravine up ahead, its rocky walls descending into a shadowy crevice. Without thinking, I made a beeline for it, hoping the steep incline would slow the creature down. I slid down the loose dirt and gravel, my arms flailing for balance as I reached the bottom. The ravine was narrow, its walls towering above me like jagged teeth. The air down here was damp and cold, the faint smell of decay lingering in the shadows. My footsteps echoed as I moved deeper into the crevice, the sound bouncing off the rock walls and amplifying my every move. For a brief moment, I thought I'd lost it. The growls and clicks were gone, replaced by the eerie silence of the ravine. I slowed my pace, leaning against the cool rock wall to catch my breath. My heart hammered against my ribs, and my hands trembled as I fumbled with the pocket knife in my jacket. It was small, barely larger than my palm, but holding it gave me a shred of comfort. The silence didn't last. A sound, faint but distinct, echoed through the ravine, a scraping noise, like claws dragging against stone. It was coming from above. I looked up, and there it was. The creature clung to the rock wall like a spider, its limbs splayed out at impossible angles. Its head hung upside down, that grotesque grin still stretched across its face as it stared at me. I didn't think. I just ran. The sound of claws scraping against stone echoed through the ravine as I sprinted, my chest heaving and legs burning with every step. The narrow path twisted ahead, the towering rock walls on either side offering no way out. I could hear it above me, scuttling along the walls with horrifying ease, its movements jerky and unnaturally fast. I glanced up as I ran, catching brief glimpses of its pale, grotesque form as it moved parallel to me. The thing wasn't just chasing me, it was stalking me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My mind raced, desperate for a plan. The ravine was tight and uneven, the rocky terrain threatening to trip me at every turn. I knew I couldn't outrun it forever, and the thought of it finally cornering me sent shivers down my spine. Then I spotted something up ahead, a cluster of boulders partially blocking the path. The gap between them was just wide enough for me to squeeze through, but the creature wouldn't fit. At least, I hoped it wouldn't. Please let this work, I whispered to myself, summoning the last reserves of my strength as I sprinted toward the rocks. I reached the narrow gap and threw myself into it, my shoulders scraping against the jagged edges as I forced my way through. The stone tore my jacket and cut into my skin, but I didn't care. I pushed harder, gritting my teeth against the pain, until I finally emerged on the other side. The moment I was through, I turned and pressed my back against the largest boulder, clutching my pocket knife in one trembling hand. My breath came in ragged gasps as I strained to hear any sign of the creature. For a few heart-stopping moments, there was nothing, just silence. Then, a low growl rumbled from the other side of the rocks. I could hear it pacing back and forth, its claws clicking against the stone as it searched for another way through. My heart pounded in my chest, and I tightened my grip on the knife, though I knew it wouldn't do much good if it managed to get through. The growling grew louder, more frustrated, and I could hear the creature clawing at the boulders, testing their strength. The rocks shifted slightly under the force, sending a shower of loose dirt and pebbles tumbling down. I held my breath, praying the barrier would hold, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence was deafening. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle in my body tense, listening for any hint of movement. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity. Was it gone? Had it given up? I didn't dare move, didn't dare even breathe too loudly. And that's when I heard it, a faint, wet clicking sound. It was above me. The wet clicking sound echoed down the ravine, sending a fresh wave of terror coursing through me. My eyes shot upward, and there it was. The creature clung to the rocks above like some grotesque insect, its elongated limbs splayed out as it moved with unnerving ease. Its hollow socket seemed to lock onto mine, and for a moment, it just hung there, its lipless grin stretching wider. I froze, pressing myself against the cold boulder at my back, gripping the small knife in my hand so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The rocks boxed me in, and the creature knew it. It began to descend. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, as though its body wasn't entirely under its own control. Long, spindly fingers scraped against the stone as it lowered itself closer, the clicking sound growing louder with each deliberate movement. I couldn't look away. My breath hitched in my chest as it dropped down to the ground on all fours, its grotesque frame silhouetted against the faint moonlight filtering into the ravine. It stood still for a moment, its head cocked to the side, as if savoring my fear. Then it spoke. The voice that came from its throat was low and guttural, a horrible mockery of human speech. Shoo, it hissed, the sound dragging out like a warning. I couldn't take it anymore. With a strangled cry, I bolted to the left, scrambling up the rocky incline as fast as I could. The sharp edges of the rocks tore into my hands and knees, but I didn't care. All that mattered was getting away. The creature let out a piercing, guttural scream that echoed through the ravine, so loud and unnatural it made my ears ring. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it following me, its claws scraping against the rocks as it climbed in pursuit. I reached the top of the incline, my legs burning with exertion, and stumbled into the forest beyond. The dense undergrowth slowed me down, branches whipping against my face and catching on my jacket. I could still hear it behind me, that horrible clicking sound drawing closer with every second. Desperation clawed at my chest as I scanned the darkness for anything, anywhere I could hide. My eyes landed on a hollowed-out tree trunk just a few yards away, its interior black and cavernous. Without thinking, I dove inside, curling up into the tight space and holding my breath. The forest fell silent. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears as I waited, every muscle in my body tensed. Minutes passed, and then I heard it, the faint crunch of leaves as the creature moved through the trees. It stopped right outside the hollow. I clamped my hand over my mouth, stifling a gasp as its shadow loomed over the entrance. It was so close I could hear its ragged breathing, feel its presence just inches away. I held my breath, every muscle in my body frozen, as the creature's shadow darkened the entrance to the hollow tree. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it could hear it, the rapid thudding echoing in my ears like a drumbeat. The rancid smell of decay wafted in, making my stomach churn. It didn't move. The creature's breathing was shallow and wet, like air being forced through clogged pipes. It sniffed the air, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. Its long, clawed fingers gripped the edges of the hollow tree, scratching lightly against the bark as if testing its strength. I bit down on my lip to keep from making a sound, the sharp pain grounding me in the moment. If it found me, I was dead. There was no question about that. The seconds dragged on like hours as it hovered at the entrance, its twisted frame blocking the faint moonlight. Then, slowly, it leaned closer. Its face appeared in the narrow opening, the pale, stretched skin illuminated by the dim light. Those hollow eye sockets stared directly at me, or through me, as if it could see into the depths of my soul. Its mouth opened slightly, revealing those blackened, blunt teeth, and it let out a soft, guttural hiss. "Shoo!" it whispered again, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. Tears pricked at my eyes as I clenched my fists, my fingernails digging into my palms. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. I prayed silently, begged for it to leave, to lose interest, to move on. And then, as if in answer to my desperate plea, the creature straightened up. It let out a low growl, almost annoyed, and turned away from the hollow tree. Its clicking footsteps faded into the forest, growing softer and softer until they were gone. I didn't move. I couldn't trust it was really gone. Maybe it was waiting, watching, trying to lure me out. The thought kept me rooted in place, curled up in the cramped hollow, my body trembling from the strain of holding still for so long. Minutes turned into what felt like hours, and the forest remained silent. Slowly, cautiously, I allowed myself to exhale, the breath shaky and shallow. My limbs ached from being cramped in the tight space, but I didn't dare move too quickly. I peeked out of the hollow, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The forest was still, the moonlight casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. There was no sign of the creature. I forced myself to crawl out of the hollow, my legs wobbling as I stood. My instinct screamed at me to keep moving, to get as far away from this place as possible. I didn't know where I was or how far I'd strayed from the trail, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't stop. The creature was still out there, and it wasn't done with me yet. The forest felt different now. Every tree, every shadow seemed alive, watching, waiting. I stumbled forward, my legs weak and trembling from exhaustion. My breaths came shallow and uneven, each one feeling like a struggle against the weight of the terror pressing down on me. I had no idea where I was. The trail I'd been following earlier was long gone, swallowed by the dense undergrowth and the chaos of my blind sprint to escape. All I could do was keep moving and hope that, by some miracle, I'd find my way back to Piper. The air was heavy with moisture, clinging to my skin like a second layer. The faint glow of the moon filtered through the canopy above, offering just enough light to see the uneven ground beneath my feet. I tripped on a root, barely catching myself before falling face first into the dirt. I couldn't keep this up. My body was nearing its limit, every muscle screaming for rest. But every time I slowed, even for a moment, the memory of that creature's face came rushing back. The hollow eye sockets, the lipless grin, the sound of its claws scraping against the stone. I shook my head, forcing the image away. Keep going, I muttered to myself, my voice barely more than a whisper. Just keep going. Ahead of me, the forest thinned slightly, the trees giving way to a shallow stream. The faint sound of running water was the first natural noise I'd heard in what felt like hours. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small reminder that I wasn't entirely alone in this nightmare. I staggered toward the stream, dropping to my knees at its edge. The cold water stung as I splashed it onto my face, washing away the sweat and grime that clung to my skin. For a brief moment, the icy sensation cleared my head, grounding me in the present. Then I saw the tracks. They were pressed into the muddy bank of the stream, deep and deliberate. The shape was unmistakable, elongated, almost human, but distorted, with claw-like indentations where the toes should have been. They led across the stream and into the trees on the other side. My stomach twisted as I realized they were fresh. The soft click of a branch snapping behind me shattered the fragile moment of calm. My heart leapt into my throat as I spun around, my eyes darting through the darkness. There was nothing there, just shadows and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. But I knew better. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Clambering to my feet, I waded through the stream, the icy water soaking my boots and pants. The tracks on the other side seemed to lead somewhere, and for lack of a better option, I followed them, each step fueled by equal parts fear and desperation. The forest around me was silent again, but the weight of the creature's presence was unmistakable. It was still out there, somewhere, and it wasn't done with me yet. The tracks wound deeper into the forest, their path erratic but deliberate, as if whatever had made them was leading me somewhere. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being lured, but the thought of stopping or turning back was even more terrifying. My instinct screamed at me to move forward, to keep going, to stay ahead of whatever was following me. The cold water from the stream had soaked through my boots, making every step heavier. The damp chill seeped into my skin, but I barely noticed it over the pounding of my heart. My flashlight was gone, my phone useless in the absence of a signal, and the moonlight was barely enough to guide me. Still, I pressed on, navigating by sheer willpower and the faint outline of the tracks in the dirt. Then I heard it again, the clicking. It was faint at first, almost like an echo carried on the wind. But as I moved, it grew louder, more distinct. My breath hitched as I realized it wasn't coming from behind me this time. It was ahead. I stopped dead in my tracks, straining to listen. The sound was steady, deliberate, like claws tapping against stone. My eyes darted through the shadows, searching for any sign of movement. The forest around me was unnervingly still, the silence amplifying every tiny sound. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The clicking stopped. For a moment, There was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing. Then, from somewhere in the distance, came a low, guttural growl. It was the same horrible sound I'd heard earlier, deep and wet, like it was being forced through an inhuman throat. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a root. My eyes scanned the darkness frantically, but there was no sign of the creature. Still, I could feel it, its presence pressing in on me like a physical weight. I turned and ran. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted, my lungs burning and legs trembling with exhaustion. I didn't care where I was going anymore. Any direction was better than standing still. The clicking and growling seemed to follow me, echoing through the trees like a macabre symphony. Then, without warning, the ground beneath me gave way. I let out a startled cry as I tumbled forward, crashing into the dirt. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a moment I lay there, dazed and gasping. When I finally managed to sit up, I realized I'd fallen into a shallow pit. The air down here was damp and cold, and the walls of the pit were lined with jagged roots and loose dirt. I scrambled to my feet, wincing as pain shot through my ankle. It wasn't broken, but it hurt like hell. As I tried to climb out, the clicking started again, closer this time. My blood ran cold as I realized it wasn't coming from the forest anymore. It was coming from the edge of the pit. The clicking echoed louder now, impossibly close, each sound reverberating off the dirt walls of the pit. I froze, my eyes locked on the edge above me. The pale moonlight illuminated the jagged roots dangling overhead, but beyond that, the darkness was impenetrable. And then it appeared. The creature's long, clawed hand reached over the edge first, its bony fingers curling around a root with an unnatural precision. My breath caught in my throat as I watched its pale, stretched skin glisten in the faint light. Slowly, its head followed, peeking over the rim of the pit. The sight was even worse up close. The hollow sockets where its eyes should have been seen to track me, as though it could see straight into my soul. Its lipless grin stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of blackened, blunt teeth. It tilted its head, the motion jerky and insect-like, as if curious about what I would do next. Shoo! It hissed, the sound dragging out like a twisted lullaby. Panic surged through me. I stumbled backward, my injured ankle screaming in protest as I pressed myself against the far wall of the pit. My hands scrambled for anything, any weapon, any tool to defend myself. My fingers closed around a jagged rock half buried in the dirt. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. The creature began to descend, its movements eerily fluid despite its grotesque appearance. It crawled down the wall head first, its elongated limbs bending in ways no living thing should move. The clicking sound of its claws against the roots and dirt was deafening, each movement deliberate and unrelenting. I gripped the rock tightly, my knuckles white. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear myself think. There was no escape now, no running, no hiding. It was me and this thing, trapped together in the suffocating darkness of the pit. It stopped halfway down the wall, its head twisting unnaturally to look at me. The silence stretched unbearably, broken only by the faint, wet sound of its breathing. Then it lunged. I screamed, swinging the rock with every ounce of strength I had left. The jagged edge connected with its arm, tearing through the thin, stretched skin. A dark, viscous liquid oozed from the wound, the smell of rot and decay filling the air. The creature let out a shriek, a horrible, ear-piercing sound that made my head throb. It recoiled, its limbs flailing wildly as it scrambled backward up the wall. My hands shook as I clutched the rock, ready for another attack. But it didn't come. Instead, the creature perched at the edge of the pit, its hollow socket staring down at me. It tilted its head again, almost mockingly, before disappearing into the shadows above. I didn't move. I couldn't. The pit was now my prison, and the forest above was no longer a place I could escape to. I sat there in the pit, paralyzed by a cocktail of exhaustion and terror. My fingers trembled as I gripped the blood-slick rock, the dark liquid still oozing from the jagged edge. The creature's shriek echoed in my mind, a sound so unnatural it seemed to claw at the edges of my sanity. But now it was quiet, too quiet. I forced myself to move, wincing as pain radiated through my ankle. The walls of the pit loomed above me, their roots and loose dirt mocking my desperate need to climb. I needed to get out. The creature wasn't gone, it was waiting, watching. Summoning what little strength I had left, I scrambled to my feet and limped toward the nearest wall. The roots were thick here, their gnarled shapes creating a crude ladder. I grabbed the nearest one, testing its strength, and began to pull myself up. Every movement was agony. My arms burned, my legs shook, and my injured ankle throbbed with each step. Dirt crumbled beneath my boots, raining down into the pit as I climbed. All the while, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still nearby, hidden in the shadows, waiting for me to reach. The top. Halfway up, I froze. A faint sound reached my ears, a low, wet clicking. It wasn't coming from above or below. It was everywhere, echoing through the forest like some twisted melody. My grip tightened on the roots, my breath catching in my throat. "Keep going," I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible over the sound of my heartbeat. "Just keep going." I climbed faster, ignoring the searing pain in my limbs. The clicking grew louder, more erratic, until it felt like it was inside my head. By the time I reached the edge of the pit, my hands were raw, and my entire body ached. I hauled myself over the rim, collapsing onto the forest floor in a heap. The cold dirt pressed against my face as I struggled to catch my breath. My ears strained for any sound, any hint that the creature was still nearby. The forest was silent again. Slowly, I pushed myself up, my entire body trembling as I stood. The pain in my ankle was unbearable now, each step sending sharp jolts up my leg. But I couldn't stop. If I stayed here, it would find me again. I stumbled forward, the trees blurring around me as I moved. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, a chaotic mix of fear, exhaustion, and the primal urge to survive. Then, through the haze, I saw it, a faint glimmer of white against the darkness. Piper. Relief flooded my chest as I limped toward the truck, my movements frantic now. I reached the door and threw myself inside, slamming it shut and locking it in one fluid motion. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, the engine roaring to life moments later. But just as I shifted into drive, I caught a glimpse of movement in the rearview mirror. It was still there. The truck's engine roared to life, but the sound was far from comforting. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, glancing nervously between the rearview mirror and the dense forest ahead. The faint movement in the shadows behind me sent shivers down my spine. It was still out there, lurking, waiting for me to make a mistake. I floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning briefly in the damp earth before Piper lurched forward. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow dirt path that would hopefully lead me out of this nightmare. Branches scraped against the sides of the truck like skeletal fingers, and the sound made me wince, my nerves already stretched to their breaking point. Every second felt like an eternity As I navigated the uneven terrain, my mind raced with desperate thoughts, trying to make sense of everything I'd seen and heard. The creature, the symbols, the grotesque displays, it all felt too surreal, too impossible to be real. And yet, the raw pain in my ankle and the stench of decay that still clung to me were undeniable reminders that this was no hallucination. The truck hit a particularly deep rut, jarring me violently in my seat. My heart leapt into my throat as I fought to keep control of the wheel. Piper groaned in protest but kept moving, her sturdy frame a lifeline in the suffocating darkness. Then I saw it again. In the rear-view mirror, a shadow darted across the road behind me, impossibly fast. My breath caught as I realized it was keeping up with the truck, its jerky, unnatural movements just barely visible in the edge of the headlights' glow. Come on, I muttered, urging Piper to go faster. The truck's engine strained as I pushed it harder, the trees whipping past in a blur. But no matter how fast I went, the creature stayed with me, its distorted silhouette a constant presence in the mirror. And then it was gone. The absence of movement should have been a relief, but instead it filled me with dread. I scanned the mirror frantically, my eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of light, but there was nothing. Just as I began to think I'd lost it, a loud thud shook the truck. The sound came from the roof, followed by the unmistakable scrape of claws against metal. My stomach dropped as I realized it was on top of the truck. I slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched against the dirt road, and the sudden stop sent me lurching forward against the seatbelt. The creature slid off the roof, landing with a sickening thud in the headlights beam. It didn't stay down. The creature rose slowly, its limbs unfolding in that grotesque, insect-like way. Its hollow sockets locked onto mine, and that horrible, lipless grin stretched wider. This time, it wasn't letting me go. The creature stood in the harsh glow of Piper's headlights, its grotesque form fully illuminated for the first time. Its pale, stretched skin glistened with a sickly sheen, and its limbs, impossibly long and angular, twitched as though preparing to lunge. The hollow sockets where its eyes should have been locked onto me, and that lipless grin, it was wider now, almost mocking. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing for a plan. I couldn't run. I couldn't fight. This thing wasn't human, wasn't bound by the rules of the natural world. But I wasn't going to just sit there and let it win. With a deep breath, I slammed my foot on the gas. Piper roared forward, the tires spinning briefly in the dirt before launching toward the creature. It didn't move. The headlights bore down on it, the truck closing the distance in seconds. At the last possible moment, the creature sprang upward, its body twisting midair as it leapt over the hood. A sickening scrape rang out as its claws raked against the windshield, leaving deep gouges in the glass. I didn't stop. I barreled forward, my knuckles white as I gripped the wheel. The road ahead was barely visible through the damaged windshield, but I didn't care. All that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between me and that thing. A glance in the rearview mirror sent my stomach plummeting. It was chasing me again. The creature moved with terrifying speed, its elongated limbs propelling it forward in unnatural, jerky motions. It was relentless, its distorted frame gaining on the truck despite my best efforts. The road ahead twisted sharply, and I veered to the left, the tires skidding dangerously close to the edge of a steep embankment. Piper groaned in protest, but she held on, the sturdy little truck pushing through the narrow turn. For a brief moment, I thought I'd gained some ground. But then, with a sickening crunch, The creature leapt onto the back of the truck. The bed groaned under its weight. The sound of its claws scratching against the metal sending shivers down my spine. My breathing came in ragged gasps as I floored the gas pedal, desperate to shake it loose. It crawled forward, its grotesque form visible through the cracked rear window. Its hollow socket stared directly into mine, and it raised one, clawed hand, slamming it against the glass with a force that sent spiderweb cracks splintering outward. "No!" I screamed, my voice raw with terror. I swerved violently, the truck jerking from side to side as I fought to throw the creature off. The sudden movement worked. With a final screech, it lost its grip and tumbled off the truck, disappearing into the darkness. But as I sped away, one last glance in the mirror froze me in place. In the faint glow of the taillights, it stood, still watching, and in its hollow sockets, for the first time, a faint glimmer of light. I thought I'd escaped. I thought it was over. But that look in its hollow sockets, was it a warning or a promise? I still don't have the answers, and honestly, I'm not sure I want them. What do you think it was? Do you believe it's still out there? Let me know your theories in the comments below. And if this story sent chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another tale that makes you question what's waiting out there in the dark. Until next time, stay safe and stay out of the woods.